Hey everybody, Ben here from DMC Films and Cinderblock Studios, and welcome back to another acrylic painting tutorial. Today we're going to be taking a look at how different colors of light affect an object in a painting. So if you had some sort of high school science class, you probably know that light comes in a spectrum. As painters, a lot of times we want to make our highlights white, but in nature that's just not how light works. Most of the time the light colors you're going to be seeing are blue artificial lights as well as yellow tints and red tints depending on the atmosphere and the sky. But of course we can't rule out artificial lights such as stage spotlights that are blue and green. So for today's example I've prepared 5 individual spheres that we can play around with different colors of light shining on top of them. For the grayscale ones we're going to be using a yellow spot, a red spot, and a green spot. And for our 2 colored yellow ochre ones we're going to be using a red spot and a blue spot. Now in order to show a form of light over top of a color or a shape that already exists, the easiest way to do that is with a glaze. However, if I was building these shapes up from scratch, I would be adding the colors of light right into the gray as I was working. So when playing with the colors of light, you want to make sure you're not just thinking about the individual color of the light, but all of the shadow tones as well as the sort of warmer, lighter tones to it. A shadow or a highlight isn't usually just one color, it's sort of a mix and a mingling of other colors. So out of my palette I've laid some titanium white, some cad yellow medium, a little cerulean blue, and some cad red light along with my gel medium for the glaze. I'm going to start out with a tiny bit of white, but mostly yellow on that brush. And I'm using a flat brush today. I'm going to drag that into my gel medium. Water it down a little bit since I'm working on paper. And I decided, since just to make everything easier, my light's sort of going to be coming down at an angle for every single one of these. And the way light hits an object, particularly a sphere, it's also sort of going to bounce and reflect in that spherical fashion. Right where the light's hitting is going to be stronger, and then as we get out either to this edge or down to the shadows, it'll be a little bit duller. I'm just sort of dry brushing down here, barely even touching it. And now where we think we want to have that sort of, maybe it be a shine or sort of our lightest light, that is where we can add a little more white. But it shouldn't be too much at all. That is a little too much, it's a little too distinct. I'm going to blend it down a little bit on the edges, get it a little more muted. I don't want this to be real sort of shiny. I just kind of need to get that distinct light section. Right about like that. Now when you move into the shadow part of your highlights, you have to keep in mind that the color is usually going to be a cool color, but also in relationship to the color itself. For example, on our right object, we're going to be doing a green spot, so we're going to have to think of something else to use for the shadow here. However, because we're using yellow here, we should be able to make a nice purple. So I'm going to grab that yellow glaze, move some of it up here, and I'm going to actually grab a little bit of yellow, or a little bit of blue here, and start cooling it off as we move in. Sort of make that transition a little easier. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that you want to have some cooler tones as well as some warmer tones within your individual highlights. And again, we're going to take that yellow glaze, go into that red, make that a little bit warmer, a little more white I think too. Really kind of warm up this upper edge. I'm not being super concerned with the detail here, but I do want to keep my color just about right. A little more straight yellow here, no glaze. Just bringing it in. Making sure that color really pops. Right about like that. Now we can take our blue and our red and start working on a deep purple. Now, personally, I don't think cerulean blue is great for a purple. And actually add a little bit of yellow to that to tone it down. But you have that coming in, and your shadows should not go all the way to the edge. When you're thinking about lighting, you also want to think about cast lighting. Light bounces and reflects off of other objects, so we're going to actually have some of this yellow kind of bounce out and around in just a little bit. And this is a straight color, this isn't even a glaze. But I'm keeping it relatively thin. A little more water on the brush. Just going to blend that up, creating that shadowy layer. Now I'm going to get a little bit of that greenish yellow that we made earlier for this section. I'll start playing with the cast lighting. Just kind of pull that down and around. And then around the object a little bit. Keeping with that purple though, we want to make that our shadow out and around. That's a little big for a shadow for that, but there you see the yellow matching with the purple, and you still get a little bit of that underlying gray as well. Now this is of course a very strong spot, so for the next one I think I'll tone it up a little bit more, use a little more glaze. So as long as I have the Cad Red light on my palette, I'm going to use that for my red glaze. I'm just grabbing a tiny bit of that red. I want to use a lot more glaze here, or a lot more gel, to create a thinner, warmer, cleaner glaze. Come right in. So that's much better than that one. It's a lot more transparent. You get the color without getting, not really destroying that underlying gray. So I'm actually going to take all of this down again. And we're going to take a little bit of yellow and mix that in with our red and the glaze, and getting more of that to warm up the sort of gleaming where the spot's really hitting. So we'll warm that up just a bit. And we'll go into that white. Just add that tiny little bit of glare up towards the top. Now studying from life in this case really helps out. A lot of times in art schools you're going to see people doing apple studies, and it seems really tedious. A lot of times people are like, oh, I'm going to have to do 50 apple studies for this class. It's a great practice method, but again it can get really boring very quickly, but it really teaches your values and seeing where light reflects. Alright, so if we have red as our spot, we're going to want a cool color for our shadow, so in that case it's going to be green. I went and grabbed a little phthalo green blue shade. It's going to be a nice complement to the rest of this. Now I'm not going to go into the gel for this, but I'm just going to keep it thin. I'm going to just go do straight green into this shadow. And this is a little too dominant here. I'm going to take a little bit of that edge off. Maybe mix a little of that red in. A little red, little yellow, and make it more natural with the green. I'm actually going to get some of that glaze now as I work it back into the center. Looks pretty good. I feel like it's not quite red enough to make it feel like a red spot. So I'm actually going to get a different red. I'm going to get some Cad Red Medium. It has a, I don't I would say warmer, it's more of a cooler red, more toned down, darker. Let me get some of that, go into the same red mix I was doing before, get more gel. I'm just going to get it kind of right sort of down through the center, and then up and around. And we're just going to blend those the edges back in on either side. Just enough to give it a little extra color. That looks pretty good. Maybe a little messier than our last one. But I feel better about the color and the shadow anyhow. And again, this is just a very simple example. We're talking about lighting here, not supposed to so much looking at absolute detail. So I'm going to grab that green, go around the back side, work on our shadow. See, that's a little bit too much of a green. I'm going to grab some of that light red again, lighter red anyway. Mix that in, make a darker green, a little bit of water. That's much better. So green, that acts a little bit better. Let's come up a little more. My circles aren't perfectly circular, so that's actually making things a little difficult. We're actually going to get a little bit more of that red, that cad red medium, and get our cast lighting up through the back. And again, not perfect, but that's not really the point here. And a little more of that red into the shadow up towards the front. And there we have red spot and yellow spot, and as you can see, the yellow spot, the glazing layer is starting to take effect. It's getting a little more of that translucent color, and this will do just about the same. It'll get a little bit different. So finally, we've got a green spot, which is going to be a little more tricky, but you'll see what I mean as we go along here. So I still have some clear, soft, what is this called anyway, matte gel. It's just regular matte gel. It's sort of a thick, a little bit like a heavy body paint, only it's a clear gel. And have a little bit of that left. I'm going to grab the green we've been using, that same phthalo green. And that's a pretty potent green. This looks a little more blue than it does green. I'm actually going to add a little bit of yellow. I want it to seem a little more natural. That's more of a grass green now. A little bit of water. And this will be our main layer. We'll see if we can't learn from these two and make this one pretty good. Now, because we're just painting right over top of a grayscale image, you're not going to see a whole lot of color shift between the glazing layers. When we move to the color, you're actually going to see a little bit of a change, because the color you're getting from the underlying color as well as the glaze is sort of bouncing off and reflecting off of each other. And when you look down at an object for that reason, especially when creating glazing layers, you can use a yellow and a blue to create a green without ever actually using green. But of course, if you're mixing everything right in, and you're not, grab a little more yellow, keeping our gel in there. But if you're mixing your paint right in, right away, and mixing the colors such as this green into the gray, and just blending that and letting it dry without doing a glazing layer, then of course you're going to see a more pure, defined color as you mixed it. So that looks pretty good. You can see that round spot sitting on it now. Grab a little bit of white. This is when you add white to green, it actually becomes a little bit minty. So a lot of times when doing grass and natural things, you're going to want to add yellow to that green to make it seem more natural. I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to add a little more yellow to that mix. There we are. And I kind of get the feeling I should have used a round brush here. I think it might have made things a little easier. There's that distinct white section, which we can then blend a little bit out. We don't want to completely blend it out. And if you're doing a shiny surface, that white is going to be more stark, and really you're not going to be blending your edges. High contrast is an important element to sort of metal and shiny objects. So you think, alright, I've got our green spot. We need a shadow color. But green is already a cool color. So we could use red and be a little weird and kind of have a backwards mentality to that. Doesn't always really work. It can. I'm not saying, you know, don't do it in any circumstance. I'm sure a really good, nice artist, a really good artist could probably make it work. But generally speaking, probably not a good idea. I'm going to grab a little bit more blue here. And to go with our green, I'm going to use some phthalo blue. Instead of the cerulean. In addition to this blue, I'm actually going to add a little bit of red to create a bit of a purplish color, but I don't want to completely destroy the green. So let me just see what I can make with this. So I'm going to go with blue. I'm going to grab some of the CAD light. Oh, I got white on the brush now. That's not good. Accidentally touched that. So we got red, we got blue. That's making a nice dark. It's not real well rounded yet, though. Actually going to add a little bit of that green back. Now I'm too red. A little tricky. A little bit of yellow, how about? That's too much yellow. Wipe some of that away just a little bit to make it a little more complex. How do I still have red trapped in this brush? There we are. So a little bit of that yellow, just really build up the complexity. So I'm going to thin that just a bit, because again, working on paper, so I want that to flow. I have that shadow, and you know, my shadows probably aren't absolutely perfect to where the light would be. They're probably a little more shifted this way, a little longer, more defined again. But of course, we're just talking about color today. So this actually wouldn't go all the way out. It would come to about here. See, I get to the third one all of a sudden now I'm thinking. So don't call me out on that. And that, I actually really like the color of this shadow. I think I'm going to go back to this red one and use some of this in here. That's a really nice dark. I'm going to add a little more green to it and just use what's on my brush. And I'm actually going to come right back over here to this red and do that. So I really like this color. That looks a lot nicer now. Okay, so again, working on our color here. I'm actually going to get a little bit more red into this blue to do our shadowed side. And I'm going to get that CAD red medium, pull that into there. Use this as our glazing layers. Forgot, needed some of that gel. So, get a little of that dark in here. And get up to here-ish. I'll start rinse my brush and sort of dry brush and blend that stuff out. Actually, I have a little bit of water on the brush here, so but it blends it out pretty nice. And then go back to our bright green because we got to remember our cast lighting. Back, just add that a little bit. And it's not overpowering, but it's just a little bit there to give the indication that there's some bouncing light. And again, you have that bouncing light out and around a little bit. And just like that, 3 different colors on top of the gray to act as spotlights. Alright, so let's move on to our two colored examples. Now I still have a good bit of paint over here on my right palette, but I threw an additional palette up ahead of me because I needed more room for some of that matte gel. So our two spots, for example, here are going to be a red and a blue spot. So a red spot's going to be very similar to what we just did. I'm actually going to switch over to the darker red in this case, the Cad Red Medium, and it's got a little bit of sort of a greenish blue into it. That's perfectly alright. So we're going to mix that into a gel, sort of lightening it a little bit. You don't want, when you're doing glazing layers like this, you don't want to have too much paint because then you lose the transparency of the gel very easily. And a little bit of water never hurt anyone either. Okay, so now you're going to start seeing a little bit of a difference in color as I apply the paint. As you can see, it's getting warmer. The sort of duller toned gray, or not gray, sort of the duller tones of the yellow ochre are now sort of being played a little bit more and warmed up because of that red. Hold off a little bit as I get to the edge. Actually, I think I'm going to make it a little bit thicker down here. Sort of preemptive strike on the cast lighting. That looks pretty good. Come a little bit more up here. And of course I could smooth this and blend this out infinitely, but in the interest of time, you know. So from this red we're going to add a little yellow. Warm that up to start getting our place where the spot's going to actually hit. Actually might add a little bit of white too. This feels like thicker paint. I feel like I don't have enough gel in this. But I'm going to get a bunch more yellow. A little white in the gel. And a little water, because I can feel it getting a little sticky down here. There. It's our round spot. I'm actually getting a little more white. So you can add white to yellow to sort of brighten it up, but you can't add white to a lot of other colors without just changing the tint up and not actually doing anything with the light. So yellow is a more powerful color in a painting than white in terms of lighting. I'm going to add a little more of a dominant white right here. So I'm starting to get more of that color. Alright then. Now red, as we saw before, is going to have a little bit of a green kind of color to it. And this section kind of looks a little bit like an apple with that brown undertone. So we're going to get that funny blue color we were making before and add a little green to it. A little yellow. And that nice cool shadow. In. Around. I didn't really map out my shadows before I started. I probably should have. I think I'm just taking that exact same color here and just throwing some of it right in as my shadow layer here. And that's going to turn into a sort of brown in the center as we're mixing our opposite colors. More on opposite colors, you can check out the color theory video I did a little while ago. Probably be an annotation up around here somewhere. We still have that red over here, which is nice because it's acting as our cast shadow, and now we actually don't have to go back because it's already there. So, last but not least, we're going to be moving on to our blue spot. So, lucky for us, we still have a big heaping pile of gel. And I don't have any more of that cerulean left, but I do have some phthalo blue. So, I'm going to get a little bit of that on the brush. Start making a really bright, interesting gel in color. Make that spot really kind of come to life. And again, I'm pulling way more gel than I am paint, because you can very easily overpower a glazing layer. And as an alternative to a thicker gel, you can also use a glazing medium. Works just as well, if not possibly even better. So I'll take that blue, mix it in. And already you can see a little bit of a green kind of coming out of this. And that is because we're using a glaze here, and you're getting the light of the blue and you're getting the light of the yellow sort of mixing in layers and creating sort of a faux green. And of course, if I was mixing the blue and the blue color right into the yellow, or perhaps a little bit differently, then you'd be getting just a straight blue over yellow rather than the glazing effect as we're doing here today. Actually completely grabbed the wrong blue there, but it works. So from this blue, we can't really add too much yellow without making it green, so I add a tiny little bit of that. But again, you can't go overboard with it. In this case, we actually can add a little bit of white to our mix. To bring in the illusion of a brighter section. That already looks pretty good. I don't think I need a whole lot more distinct white, but before we do another mix, I'm going to again go ahead and do the preemptive strike on my cast lighting in the back. A little bit more. And just a little bit of that white right here. Add a little. Now our shadow color for the blue, again, another interesting mix. Now because blue, like green, is already a cool color, you think, well, I can't exactly do an orange shadow, but I need to do something a little bit more cool and definitely different from the blue. So for this I'm going to recommend either a mixed green or a mixed purple. I say mixed because I don't want it to be just straight out of the tube color. I want it to be a little bit more sort of complex and in-depth of a color. So because we're using sort of a lot of this green play over here, I think I'm going to do a little bit of that purple play over here. So I've got red and sort of this blue gel, which I can kind of mix together. That's still a little more red than I'd like. I'll just throw a lot more blue into it. That looks pretty good. That's still, colors aren't playing on each other quite as well as I'd like. I actually think I'm going to add a tiny bit of yellow. And that's not bad. That's a pretty nice color. Sort of a deeper blue than what we've got going on here. Similar to this, only bluer, I think. It's more of a blue-green instead of a green-blue. And our shadow color. I'm not adding very much of this at all. Just enough. And right about like that. Now with these two examples, I do want to point out one more thing, and that is you can play around with this middle section a little bit more and show more of that underlying color depending on how dominant of a light that you're going for in your particular scene. So of course you can use a thinner paint or just more glaze or gel to paint in your ratio, say 90% gel or glazing medium to the paint, to add more of a subtle glaze rather than the more dominant one that I have shown here. So between the grayscale and the color base examples here, I hope I've given you some idea of how different colors of light will affect the overall color of the object in question. So if you have any additional questions about my examples here today, feel free to leave that in the comments below, and as always, for more tips, tutorials, and other art videos, subscribe to the channel. This has been from DMC Films and Cinderblock Studios. See you guys next time.